I know this scenario is a bit out there, but Danes have been involved in Germanic politics since Charlemagne, so just bear with me as our tale takes us to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. It's always Napoleon, isn't it? Anyways, at the Congress of Vienna, Britain and Sweden, fearing an ascendant Prussia, actually honored the Treaty of Kiel, an earlier agreement to draw Denmark away from Napoleon. So, Denmark got both the Duchy of Saxe-Lauenburg as well as Swedish Pomerania, bringing many more Germans under the Danish crown. Worried about integrating these populations, King Frederick VI, drawing inspiration from the Habsburgs, began promoting monarchical nationalism, the idea that loyalty to the king transcended language and culture, forging a single nation out of Danes, Germans, and even distant subjects in Iceland, the Faroes, and Greenland. According to Frederick, language would be bridged through bilingual administration, while culture would gradually merge under common royal tradition. Consequently, a council with representatives from each region was established, advising Frederick to ensure grievances from faraway lands were quickly addressed. Concomitantly, the military was centralized, with a new academy established in Zealand, where officers from every province trained side by side, swearing oaths of loyalty to their king. So, greetings to you, over 69,000 Danes, and the 80% of Prussians who haven't subscribed yet, as we aim to expand to 75,000 subs by the end of December. If you'd like to go a step further, you can also support me on Patreon, where you'll get access to the maps and other exclusive content from the videos. Now, back into the video. By the time Christian VIII ascended the throne in 1839, monarchical nationalism had taken root amongst the elite, so he embraced his predecessor's vision, encouraging German schools in the southern duchies to teach Danish history and royal symbolism. However, the true test arrived with the revolutions of 1848 and the coronation of Frederick VII. Even before his ascension, it had become clear that Denmark's absolute monarchy could not survive the liberal currents sweeping across Europe. Immediately upon his ascension, Frederick VII summoned a grand constitutional assembly of representatives from his entire realm, reconstituting the prior council into a permanent bicameral Riksdag, accepting constitutional restrictions protecting freedom of language, press, and religion, all while maintaining the indivisibility of the realm under the House of Oldenburg. Despite this, German nationalists rejected the settlement, already perturbed by Christian VIII's open letter of 1846 that changed the German state's succession to allow female rulers, effectively permanently tying them to Denmark no matter who sat atop the Danish throne. Thus, in 1848, a provisional government was created in Schleswig-Holstein, alongside the rest of their revolutionary kinsmen in the German Confederation. Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia was preoccupied by rebels, but had his own designs on the region, though received conflicting advice. Some counselors urged immediate action, others warned of backlash, while still others pointed to Danish Pomerania as the real prize. Ultimately, he tried to incite rebellion in Pomerania, so Prussian mobilization lagged behind schedule, and these efforts were largely unsuccessful. Those delays proved decisive, as without the Prussian columns, Danish regular forces crushed the initial insurgents, retook Rendsburg, and pushed deep into Holstein. When the Teutons finally entered the fray, they ignored Holstein entirely, striking instead at Pomerania, which eventually fell. However, the cost was immense. By focusing on Pomerania, Prussia had allowed the Danes to cement internal control as the war dragged on. Britain, and especially Russia, who had close blood ties to the Danes, were unhappy as Baltic trade ground to a halt, so demanded an immediate ceasefire and began mediations. Denmark was willing to cede Pomerania in exchange for recognition of Schleswig and Holstein, which every great power except Prussia supported. But Friedrich Wilhelm, egged on by many in Prussia, who still felt Denmark had cheated them back in 1815 at Vienna, demanded full independence for both duchies. Under Prussian guidance, of course. When Denmark refused, the conference collapsed, and fighting resumed in early 1849. As Prussia advanced confidently into Holstein, a series of mishaps turned the tide. Field Marshal von Wrangel fell to a Danish cannonball, Danish brigade smashed the Hanoverian contingent, and a daring Danish cavalry charge shattered the German reserves, as Denmark took the offensive. At the Battle of Altona, some Prussians were encircled and defeated, humiliating Berlin. The Danes then marched uncontested, occupying Lübeck and Hamburg, as well as Czechs of Mecklenburg and Hanover. Denmark was especially vengeful towards Oldenburg, who, although their blood relations, had closely aligned with Prussia. With this momentum, they then appealed to the great powers to step in. Russia, fresh from crushing the Hungarian Revolution for Austria, and Britain were both determined to preserve Danish control of the Sound, so were joined by France, Austria, and Sweden-Norway in forcing an end to the war. Prussia, terrified that the powers would intervene directly and potentially seize the Rhineland or Silesia, signed a white peace with Denmark, leaving the smaller German states to face Denmark alone. Meanwhile, the young Kaiser Franz Joseph, eager to reassert Austrian leadership, agreed to settle the internal Germanic matters, signing the Copenhagen-Vienna Accord, ending the war on Danish terms as Denmark and Austria became allies. The revolutionary Frankfurt Assembly was dissolved, restoring the German Confederation, while Denmark was vastly augmented to check Prussia, acquiring Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Oldenburg, Lübeck, and Hamburg. Hanover accepted Danish protection, while Saxony did the same for Austria. All Danish lands then formed a single constitutional kingdom, while the lands outside the German Confederation shared the same extraterritorial status as those of the Habsburgs and Hohenzollerns. Lastly, to appease the other great powers, the Sound toll, the shipping tax collected by Denmark, was phased out. Across the Danish realm, integration began at once, expanding the Riksdag with deputies from the newly acquired lands. While Danish remained the official language, the royal anthem was sung in both German and Danish at the opening of each session of Parliament, while debates were in German and Danish alike. New shipyards rose to replace lost Sound revenue, tariffs collected in the former Hanseatic cities flowed into Copenhagen, who began extensive railway efforts to further tie the nation together. With so many new territories to integrate, Copenhagen's ministers were suddenly drowning in paperwork, reports, and plans. If you've ever felt buried under your own reading list, that's where my friends at Shortform come in. I'm not sponsored by them, I actually use them and have an affiliate link below, so that's why I'm excited to bring them up, as Shortform makes the absolute best nonfiction book guides. So, if you like to read, which you probably do if you watch my channel and want to help my channel out, use my link below, shortform.com/Fidentes, to get $50 off the annual plan. They're super detailed with 5 to 10 minute overviews of the general themes of books, but they also have detailed sections on each chapter, alongside various interactive exercises to actually drill the key points into you. This is the best for me, because let me tell you, the number of books I've read that come in one ear and go out the next is too high to count. So having something like that is a game changer. Now, back into the video. Overseas, Denmark resisted British pressures and chose to retain Trankebar and her other Indian colonies. Without the Sound toll, they looked for other ways to cover the lost revenue, so with a much larger domestic population to conduct trade to and from, these distant colonies became profitable once more, especially as they further invested in possessions in the Gold Coast and the Caribbean. As a result, naval budgets grew as the Danes' seafaring capabilities began to match other great powers. While Vienna was pleased with the outcome, they knew the Russian alliance was temporary at best, as the Balkans would surely Balkan it up at some point, so Denmark was a useful counterweight. Yet, Austria still worried about renewed revolts from the Magyars, Czechs, Poles, and other South Slavs, recognizing the need to acquire more Germans to dilute these people's importance, inevitably turning to Saxony, whose 2 million Germans were ultimately their answer. Unfortunately for Austria, Prussia had her own designs on Saxony, having previously tried to annex the whole kingdom after Napoleon, so the Saxons were stuck between a rock and a hard place. When the childless Frederick Augustus II of Saxony died in 1854, his brother Johann, a staunch supporter of the Habsburgs, recognizing his perilous position, submitted to Franz Joseph while he retained his own crown. In conjunction, Johann's son, Albert, married a Habsburg princess to solidify the union. Prussian envoys thundered that the transaction violated the German Confederation. Austrian diplomats retorted that voluntary union required no external consent. Troops from all three armies were sent out and engaged in a few minor skirmishes, but the Confederation, still reeling from the Danish fiasco, recognized the Saxon compromise to prevent war, forcing Prussia's hand as the Hohenzollern stood down. 9 years later, Frederick VII died, ending the line of Oldenburg, so Christian IX from the Glücksburg cadet line ascended the Danish throne. Although the succession had been long settled, a handful of irreconcilable German nobles declared that the Glücksburg line was illegitimate and thus revolted. However, few rallied to their cause. 2 decades of investment and shared military service had bound the North German coast closer to Copenhagen than many had thought. The rebels did control a few town halls and some fortresses before Danish regulars and loyal militiamen scattered them. Yet, the uprising gave Prussia the pretext it had awaited. Within days of the first shots, Prussian mobilization orders went out, and the long-dreaded War of the German Brothers began. Prussia had been long preparing for the war, already strengthening ties to many German states, so appealed to their confederation to free their brethren from the Danish tyranny, and many did answer the call. However, the Viennese coalition refused, demanding that Berlin respect Copenhagen's rights. The wild card here was Hanover. While King George V was partial towards Austria, the Prussians offered to liberate his kingdom from the Danish yoke, something that Vienna would never accede to. So, he ignored his parliament's wishes of neutrality, declaring for Prussia. While geographically large, Hanover could only muster a measly 20,000 men, so it was not threatening to the Danes. The recently unified Italians were Prussia's ace in the hole, having just established an alliance, but they were in a much worse position than historically. Its army was still a patchwork of regional forces with poor training, weak logistics, and a millennia of rivalries between themselves. Politically, the kingdom was only 2 years old and struggling with rebellions across the south, while Napoleon III was less than eager to aid them after Garibaldi, worthless piece of Freemasonic trash that he was, tried to conquer the remains of the Papal States in 1862. With Austria occupied on two fronts, the Prussians planned on a rapid victory, dividing their force in two. Albrecht von Roon led 172,000 north against Denmark, while Helmuth von Moltke commanded 384,000 south against Austria and her allies. In response, Denmark mobilized 150,000 under Christian de Massa, while Austria and her allies raised 520,000 under Ludwig von Benedek. On the Italian front, Archduke Albrecht Friedrich held the frontier with 130,000 against 190,000 Italians under Alfonso Ferrero La Marmora. The first Prussian moves looked promising. Roon overran Mecklenburg and Pomerania, though coastal fortresses held out due to the Danish navy. In the south, Moltke pushed into Saxony and Bohemia, but the Austrians and their allies had also spent time preparing for the war, and thus had many modern defenses, leading to a standstill. Roon battered against the Danish lines, slowly grinding forward at terrible cost. Moltke gained ground, yet failed to break the Austrians, while Friedrich held the Italians. As the war dragged on, and Denmark proved her mettle, King Charles V of Sweden, a strong advocate of Scandinavian solidarity, allowed 40,000 volunteers to aid Denmark. In reality, these were professional Swedish soldiers, but Sweden didn't want to officially enter the war, though she feared the threat to Scandinavian security if Prussia won and dominated the Baltic. These also came alongside promises from Copenhagen to restore former Swedish lands lost in Germany. This, naturally, led to fierce naval warfare across the Baltic, ending any trade, angering both Britain and Russia, who began pressuring for an end to the conflict. Meanwhile, Napoleon III saw the chance to restore France's natural border along the Rhine. Ignore the fact that these were only French for like 15 years under Napoleon and were completely full of German peoples. But don't think about that. So began talks with Vienna, who were desperate to deliver the knockout punch. Despite Bismarck's vague promises of border rectifications that had bought temporary French neutrality, the emperor was growing impatient. As the weather began to turn and Prussian columns began stalling out, Napoleon mobilized his forces and demanded immediate compensation for continued restraint. So, Bismarck, desperate to keep France sidelined, gave up the Saar, angering many German liberals. Across the Channel, Britain assumed the Danish position untenable, so their unexpected tenacity, the arrival of Swedish-Norwegian brigades, and above all, the French seizure of the Saar changed their position. Palmerston's cabinet now feared that the conflagration would open the door to French domination of the continent. Urgent messages flew across Europe, demanding an immediate armistice, yet none of the combatants felt ready to lay down their arms, while victory still seemed possible. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar favored the Danes, but saw no reason to enter while Austria and Prussia exhausted one another, as a prolonged war would leave the Balkans ripe for future harvest. Worried about impending diplomatic pressures, Prussia rushed to finish the war. Roon, believing he had finally outmaneuvered de Massa, swung through Lauenburg to encircle the main Danish army against the Baltic coast. But the force was encircled by another contingent of Swedes, capturing most of the northern army. Denmark then pressed her advantage, defeating smaller Prussian forces to control northern Germany. Southward, Italy had achieved nothing, wasting tens of thousands of men before they made peace, worried about any potential machinations of Napoleon. They renounced claims on any Habsburg lands and recognized the sovereignty of the Pope, who Austria henceforth guaranteed. 100,000 Austrian veterans promptly marched northward, turning the tide in Vienna's favor. Nonetheless, Prussia fought on as Wilhelm and the general staff refused every suggestion of negotiation, convinced that one more victory would still allow them to achieve status quo ante bellum. But it was not to be. After solidifying their position, the Danes rapidly converged outside of Neuruppin, where the remnants of Roon's army broke, opening the door to Berlin. So, while von Moltke had not yet been defeated despite being vastly outnumbered, Prussia requested an armistice, only to be rebuffed. Franz Joseph was eager to humiliate the Hohenzollerns and remind them that the House of Habsburg always had and always would be the preeminent German power. This forced the remaining Prussians to retreat and defend the capital, enabling the Danes and Austrians to encircle Berlin before eventually taking it. After which, they held massive parades through the city, ceremoniously tearing down the equestrian statue of Frederick the Great, humiliating the Prussians. At this point, Russia, fearing a complete collapse of Prussia, stepped in to mediate a peace. Naturally, Austria reclaimed her rightful lands in Silesia, while they formed a new Rhinish state under Leopold II, the former Habsburg Grand Duke of Tuscany. So, although not directly part of Austria, in essence it was. Saxony too was greatly expanded. Meanwhile, the rest of their German allies took lands from Prussia and her allies. While France had not entered the war per se, the threat of their entrance had proved important, so were expanded slightly into the Rhine, as well as Austria forcing Holland to sell Luxembourg to them. Most importantly, Denmark received the lion spoils from the war, taking Hanover while forming numerous clients to strip land from Prussia. Sweden too regained Wismar and parts of Pomerania and Bremen-Verden. The most significant change was that the German Confederation was dissolved, mostly thanks to Russian diplomacy. Eager to find some way to weaken Austria, they pressed for their Danish kindred to lead a North German Confederation, while Austria received her own sphere among South Germans. Once established, this immediately shot Russia in the foot, as Denmark, fearing the massive imbalance of Germans to Danes in this new group, convinced Sweden, who is now already involved in German politics, to join in, adding more Scandinavians into this Frankenstein's amalgamation of a Germany, leaving two massive states on Russia's doorstep. The hybrid polity focused on administrative unity as sweeping legislation was quickly implemented in the following years to standardize life across the realm. Free movement of people, common passports and postal systems, equal religious rights, unified weights and measures, and a shared penal code, all of which were based on Danish and Swedish laws. A bicameral parliament composed of the Riksdag, which superseded the previously established one in Copenhagen, representing citizens from Denmark, Sweden, and the various German states, and a Forbundsrådet, where member governments held veto power, ensuring the small Germanic duchies and Scandinavian kingdoms could check one another. Because the Confederation was relatively balanced between ethnic Germans and Scandinavians, Denmark lacked Prussia's historical ability to dominate. Though Sweden and Denmark, by far the strongest nations, quickly realized if they worked in tandem they could control it in any way they saw fit. Ultimately, with two separate Germanic confederations established, the German unification movement was dead. The nations in power had no intention to lead multinational movements that would only work against their current interests, so they failed where the Italians had, unfortunately, succeeded. Any thought of a unified Germany was now firmly in the hands of Scandinavia, who wanted no such thing. If you like this, now you should watch this video of a timeline where the Danes defeated the Swedish rebels in the 16th century, preserving the Kalmar Union. If you appreciate my work, please subscribe to help me get to 75,000 subs by the end of the month, and consider supporting me on Patreon to get ad-free viewing, maps, and more. These videos are only possible thanks to my patrons' generous support. Goodbye.